Sophia Carter had worked at Alexander Cole's mansion for nearly 3 years. It was never an easy job. Alexander was a man of high expectations and little patience. He never paid much attention to the people who worked for him, seeing them as necessary but insignificant parts of his world. To him, employees existed to do their job quietly, efficiently, and without bothering him. Sophia had long accepted that reality. She was here to work, not to be noticed. But that all changed one evening when she was called into Alexander's office. She had just finished polishing the bookshelves in the grand study when his deep, commanding voice sliced through the quiet air. "Sophia." She turned quickly, standing upright, hands instinctively clasped in front of her. "Yes, sir?" Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled in front of him, his gaze sharp and assessing. His dark gray suit was as impeccable as always, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't speak, and Sophia felt her heart rate pick up slightly. It wasn't often that he addressed her directly. "I need you to accompany me to an important dinner tonight." Sophia blinked, sure she had misheard him. Excuse me?" His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he disliked repeating himself. "I have a business dinner with potential investors. I don't have time to arrange for a suitable companion. So you will be coming with me." Sophia felt a strange sense of unease creeping up her spine. This wasn't a request, it was an order. I don't understand," she admitted cautiously. "Why me?" Alexander let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temple as if he were speaking to a child. "Because you are here, and I don't have the patience to find someone else." His tone was cool, dismissive. "It's a simple task. You'll sit beside me, remain silent, and look presentable. I need someone who won't embarrass me or demand attention. Can you manage that?" Sophia felt a prickle of irritation at his words. He wanted someone invisible, someone to be seen but not heard. He didn't see her as a person, only a convenient solution to his last-minute problem. But still, this was an opportunity. It might not have been the kind she had imagined, but Sophia had long promised herself that one day, she would no longer be the woman people overlooked. This dinner, no matter how much Alexander tried to make her insignificant, was a chance to prove that she was more than just a housekeeper. Lifting her chin slightly, she met his gaze and said, "Yes, sir, I can manage that." For the first time, Alexander actually looked at her. Not just through her, but at her, as if noticing something he hadn't before. He gave a curt nod. "Good, wear something appropriate." And just like that, she was dismissed. Sophia wasn't one for expensive clothing. She had never needed anything beyond simple, practical attire. But that evening, as she stood in front of the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. The elegant black dress, provided by one of the mansion's assistants at Alexander's request, fit her like a second skin, sophisticated, yet understated. Her hair, usually tied back in a simple ponytail, had been styled into soft waves that framed her face. A touch of makeup highlighted her features, bringing out the warmth in her brown eyes. For a moment, she hesitated. Would she truly be able to pull this off? She had spent years blending into the background, avoiding attention, keeping her voice quiet. But tonight, she was stepping into a world she didn't belong in, a world where men like Alexander Cole dictated the rules. Taking a steadying breath, she reminded herself, she was more than just a housekeeper. No matter how much Alexander or his investors tried to make her feel otherwise. When she arrived at the front entrance of the mansion, Alexander was already waiting by his car. His expression was unreadable as his gaze flickered over her appearance. "Let's go," he said, opening the door without another word. No compliment, no acknowledgement. It didn't surprise her. The ride to the restaurant was quiet, save for the sound of Alexander typing away on his phone. Sophia kept her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window at the passing city lights. When they arrived at the venue, a high-end, exclusive restaurant reserved for the most elite of business moguls, she felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Everywhere she looked, there were men in tailored suits, women adorned in designer dresses, conversations murmuring in hushed, calculated tones. This was Alexander's world, and tonight, she was stepping into it. As they entered, all eyes turned toward them. Or rather, toward Alexander. He was a known figure in the business world, his presence commanded attention. But it wasn't long before the glances shifted toward her. Sophia felt it immediately, the unspoken judgment. The silent questions. Who was she? Why was she here? She didn't belong, and they all knew it. Alexander, however, barely noticed. He led her to the table where the investors were waiting, barely sparing her a second glance as he gestured toward her dismissively. This is Sophia. She's accompanying me tonight. That was it. No introduction, no explanation, just a vague acknowledgement before he turned back to business. Sophia resisted the urge to let out a bitter laugh. She had expected it, but it still stung. She took her seat, hands resting in her lap, keeping her expression neutral. The investors, 3 older men in sharp suits, gave polite nods, though their eyes held curiosity, perhaps even mild amusement. Sophia was used to being invisible. But tonight, for some reason, it felt different. As the dinner began, she listened in silence as the men spoke about numbers, investments, and expansion plans. She understood little of their jargon, but she did understand people. And the more she listened, the more she realized that beneath all the business talk, these men weren't just interested in numbers. They were interested in character. They wanted confidence. They wanted vision. And Alexander, though undeniably powerful, was failing to show them that tonight. They were waiting for something more. Sophia felt her pulse quicken. She knew she had to stay silent. But this was an opportunity. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to waste it. What do you think? Should Sophia stay quiet or take a chance and speak up? Let us know in the comments. If you admire Sophia's courage, hit like to support her journey. Subscribe for more inspiring stories, because sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the biggest changes. The moment Sophia stepped into the restaurant, she felt it. The weight of 100 eyes. The silent scrutiny. The unspoken judgment. This wasn't just any restaurant. It was the Ashford, a place where billionaires and high-profile executives made deals that shaped industries. A place where power wasn't just displayed, it was wielded. And yet, here she was, a housekeeper, walking into a world she didn't belong in. Alexander Cole barely acknowledged her as he led her toward the long, candlelit table where the investors were waiting. His presence commanded attention, as it always did, but tonight, something was different. People were looking at her, noticing her, and for the first time, she didn't have the safety of invisibility. Her heart pounded, but she kept her posture straight, chin slightly lifted, reminding herself of one truth. She was more than they thought she was. As they approached the table, 3 sharply dressed men in their 50s greeted Alexander with firm handshakes and polite but calculated smiles. These were the investors Alexander had been trying to win over, men with the power to make or break his company's future. And then, their eyes landed on her. There was a brief pause, a flicker of confusion, an unspoken question. Who is she? Alexander, either oblivious or simply indifferent, gestured toward her dismissively. This is Sophia. She's accompanying me tonight. That was it. No introduction, no explanation, just a vague acknowledgement before he turned away, already shifting the conversation to business. Sophia resisted the urge to scoff. She had expected this, but somehow, it still stung. The investors barely nodded at her before returning their attention to the conversation. She wasn't offended. Not really. This was Alexander's world, a world where power dictated respect. And she? She was nothing to them. Just an accessory, a background decoration. But that was about to change. Dinner was a spectacle of polished words and smooth negotiations. The men spoke in numbers and statistics, discussing stocks, acquisitions, and multi-million-dollar deals with the ease of discussing the weather. Sophia remained silent, as instructed, sipping her water and observing everything. And that's when she noticed it. The shift, the slight impatience in the investors' expressions. The way their responses to Alexander became shorter, less engaged. The way their interest was waning. They weren't impressed. Alexander was speaking their language. Yes, but he wasn't saying anything new. He was playing it safe, regurgitating financial projections and growth patterns they had already read in the reports. And these men? They weren't here for that. They were here to be convinced, to be inspired. And Alexander? He wasn't doing that. For the first time, Sophia realized, these men weren't just investing in a company. They were investing in a leader. And right now, they weren't seeing one. Then, it happened. One of the investors, Mr. Lewis, turned to her. She had noticed him watching her throughout the evening, curiosity flickering in his sharp blue eyes. "So, Sophia," he said, swirling his wine glass with an amused expression, "how do you feel about attending a business dinner like this?" The table went silent. The question was innocent enough. But the tone? The slight smirk? The expectation of a flustered, timid response? It wasn't a conversation starter. It was a test. And everyone at the table knew it. Alexander stiffened beside her, his grip tightening slightly on his fork. He had told her to be invisible. But now, all eyes were on her. Waiting. Expecting. She could feel Alexander's warning in the air, "Stay quiet. Don't embarrass me." She could smile politely, laugh it off, say something insignificant. Or, she could change the game. Sophia took a slow sip of her water, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them wonder. Then, she met Mr. Lewis' gaze and smiled. "Actually, it's fascinating," she said, her voice calm and composed. "Seeing how everything works up close is a rare opportunity. The numbers and projections are interesting, of course. But I think understanding the people behind those numbers is even more important." Silence. A beat too long. Then, Mr. Lewis let out a quiet laugh, his smirk shifting into something else. Interest. Intrigue. Alexander's jaw tightened, his fork clinking against his plate. And suddenly, she wasn't invisible anymore. The conversation shifted. Sophia hadn't just answered a question. She had steered the conversation. Mr. Lewis leaned forward slightly, engaging with her, asking follow-up questions. "And Sophia?" She answered, calmly, intelligently. She didn't pretend to be an expert. But she did have something far more valuable, insight. When the discussion turned to corporate responsibility, she seized the moment. "Successful companies aren't just built on profits," she said. "They're built on trust. A company that invests in people, employees, customers, communities, isn't just making a financial decision. They're making a long-term investment in their reputation and stability." Mr. Lewis nodded approvingly. "I couldn't agree more," he said. The other investors exchanged glances. Sophia saw it in their eyes. They respected her, not because of her position, but because of her perspective. And Alexander? He sat there in silence, watching as the investors, the men he had spent months trying to impress, were suddenly more interested in what she had to say. He had brought her here to be invisible. And now, she had become the most memorable person at the table. By the end of the night, the investors shook Alexander's hand. But their last words weren't about him. They were about her. "You've got an interesting companion there, Alexander," Mr. Lewis remarked. "I'd pay attention to what she has to say." And just like that, they were gone. The moment the restaurant doors closed behind them, Sophia felt the energy shift. Alexander turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What?" he said, voice dangerously quiet. "Was that?" Sophia met his gaze evenly. "I answered a question," she said simply. His jaw clenched. "You didn't just answer a question," he snapped. "You stole the conversation. You made it about you." Sophia crossed her arms. "I didn't make it about me. They did." His eyes darkened. "I told you to be invisible." A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. Looks like that didn't work out. For the first time in his life, Alexander Cole had nothing to say. The ride back to the mansion was suffocating. Sophia sat stiffly in the leather seat of Alexander Cole's luxury car, staring out of the window at the city lights flashing past. The silence between them was thick, heavy, dangerous. She could feel the weight of his anger, the barely contained frustration radiating off of him. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the restaurant. But she knew it was coming. And when it did, it came like a storm. What the hell was that? His voice was low, controlled, but laced with fury. Sophia turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I answered a question. You weren't supposed to answer anything." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "You were supposed to sit there and be quiet." She met his gaze, unflinching. "And why is that, exactly?" His jaw clenched. "Because that was a business dinner. Not a platform for you to prove something." Sophia let out a breath, shaking her head. "That's exactly the problem, Alexander. You act like business is just about numbers. But it's not. It's about people. The people who work for you, who invest in you, who trust you." She turned her body slightly, facing him fully now. "You weren't impressing them. You were boring them. They wanted something real. And I gave them that." His grip on the wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. For the first time, Alexander Cole looked rattled. You embarrassed me, he finally said. His voice was quieter now, but somehow more cutting. Sophia let out a humorless laugh. No, Alexander. I embarrassed you because I proved that I had something worth saying, and you didn't. A beat of silence. Then, without another word, he pulled up to the mansion. Before she could even process what was happening, he got out, slamming his door shut. Sophia exhaled slowly, staring at the massive estate before her. She had worked here for 3 years. She had cleaned these rooms, polished these floors, folded these clothes. But tonight, it no longer felt like home. And deep down, she knew this was the last time she would step foot in this house. The moment they stepped inside, Alexander turned to face her. You're fired. Sophia had expected it, but hearing it still felt like a slap to the face. She kept her expression calm, but inside, her heart clenched. He wasn't just dismissing her from a job, he was dismissing her existence from his world. I figured as much, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Alexander's jaw twitched. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, something almost like regret. But then, it was gone. Sophia nodded once and turned away. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to fight. She was going to walk away with her head held high. Packing her things was harder than she expected. Each item she placed in her small, worn-out suitcase reminded her of the years she had spent here. The long nights, the exhaustion, the feeling of invisibility. She had given everything to this house. To him. And yet, the moment she had spoken up, the moment she had proven she was worth more, he had thrown her away. But as she zipped up her bag, something inside her shifted. This wasn't the end. This was a beginning. She had spent too long blending into the background, too long believing she wasn't meant for more. Tonight had changed that. She had been heard, and she would never be invisible again. She was halfway down the long driveway when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Frowning, she answered. Hello? Ms. Carter. A familiar voice. Deep, calm. Mr. Lewis. One of the investors from the dinner. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. I hope I'm not calling too late, he continued, but I wanted to offer you something. Sophia swallowed hard. What kind of offer? A job. Her breath caught. He chuckled softly, sensing her surprise. I meant what I said at dinner. I liked what you had to say. And I think my company could use someone with your perspective. Sophia pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. A job. A real opportunity. Her fingers tightened around the phone. I'll take it. If Alexander Cole thought he had crushed her, he was dead wrong. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Sophia went from being a housekeeper to an executive assistant at one of the most prestigious firms in the city. At first, she felt out of place. She wasn't used to boardrooms or business meetings. She wasn't used to sitting at a desk instead of scrubbing floors. But she learned. She observed, listened, and adapted. And soon, she wasn't just taking notes at meetings, she was contributing to them. Mr. Lewis took notice, and so did everyone else. Meanwhile, Alexander's world was falling apart. Without the investors' full confidence, his company's stock began to drop. Deals fell through. His leadership was questioned. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, Mr. Lewis' firm acquired a significant stake in Alexander's company. And with that, Sophia Carter was back, not as a housekeeper, not as an accessory, but as someone who now had power. The moment she stepped into the boardroom, Alexander froze. For the first time in his life, he looked speechless. Gone was the woman he had dismissed, the woman he had fired without a second thought. She stood tall, composed, exuding confidence in a way that demanded respect. Their eyes met, and for the first time, he looked afraid. After the meeting, he approached her. Sophia. She turned, arching a brow. Mr. Cole. A flicker of something crossed his face at the formal address. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. You're with them? She crossed her arms. That's right. Silence. Then, a quiet, almost hesitant question. Why? Sophia tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then, she gave him the answer he deserved. Because unlike you, she said softly, they actually listened to what I have to say. His eyes darkened, his expression shifting. But before he could say another word, she turned and walked away. And this time, she was leaving on her own terms. What do you think? Did Sophia get the justice she deserved? Let us know in the comments. If you admire Sophia's strength and journey, hit like to support her. Subscribe for more inspiring stories, because sometimes the ones who are overlooked become the ones who rise the highest. The moment Sophia Carter stepped into the boardroom, she felt it, that shift in the air, that stunned, almost unbelieving silence. And at the head of the long conference table? Alexander Cole. His hands gripped the armrests of his leather chair, his entire body rigid, his face, usually composed, always unreadable, was frozen in an expression Sophia had never seen before. Shock, disbelief, and, beneath it all, fear. Because for the first time, she had power. 6 months ago, she had walked out of his mansion with nothing but a suitcase. She had been discarded, dismissed, treated as insignificant, and now, she was sitting across from him, not as a housekeeper, but as someone who had a say in his company's future. Fate had a sense of humor. And tonight, Alexander was about to be humbled. The meeting began. Sophia sat beside Mr. Lewis, who had been the one to bring her into this world. But she wasn't here just because of him. She was here because she belonged. She listened, absorbing every word as the investors discussed the company's crisis, how Alexander's leadership had led to poor decisions, lost deals, plummeting trust. It was everything he had once dismissed her for pointing out. And now, he was facing the consequences. Then, it happened. Mr. Lewis turned toward her. "Ms. Carter," he said smoothly, "what do you think?" The room fell silent. Sophia felt the weight of every eye in the room, including Alexander's. She could practically feel the tension radiating from him. The way his fingers curled against the table. The way his chest rose and fell just a little too fast. He was waiting for her to stumble, to prove that she didn't belong. But she wouldn't. She refused. With a calm breath, she lifted her chin and met the gaze of the most powerful men in the room. And she spoke. "Trust," she began, her voice smooth, confident, steady. "That's what's missing here." The room remained silent. No interruptions. No dismissive glances. They were listening. Numbers are important. Projections are essential. But what Alexander Cole has forgotten is that success is not just built on financial gain. It's built on trust, from investors, from employees, from the people who believe in this company. And right now, she leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Alexander. That trust is gone. She saw it. That flicker of something in his eyes. Anger? Regret? Or was it something deeper? Something he didn't want to admit? "You can fix the numbers," she continued, "but unless you rebuild the trust you've lost, this company won't survive." A beat of silence. Then, one of the investors nodded. "She's right." More murmurs of agreement. Alexander's grip tightened on the table, his jaw flexing. For once in his life, he had no control, and Sophia Carter had all of it. The meeting ended. The investors left, discussion still buzzing in the air. Sophia stood, gathering her notes, preparing to leave. And then, a voice. Low, tense. "Stay." She turned. Alexander was still seated, his eyes dark, intense, locked onto hers. Everyone else had left the room. It was just them, alone. For the first time since she had walked away from him. Sophia inhaled slowly, crossing her arms. "You have something to say, Mr. Cole?" The use of his last name, cold, distant, professional, landed between them like a knife. A flicker of something crossed his face. Something like pain. Then, he stood. He stepped closer. Too close. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but not angry. "Not anymore. You proved me wrong," he murmured. Sophia blinked. She hadn't expected that. Not from him. Alexander let out a slow, bitter breath. "You were right about everything," he admitted. "I didn't listen. I refused to." Sophia studied him. This man, the one who had fired her, belittled her, acted as though she was nothing, now looked lost. "I ruined everything," he muttered, shaking his head. Sophia tilted her head slightly. "No," she said. "You chose this." His gaze snapped to hers. And she saw it. Regret. Raw, painful, undeniable regret. For what he had done. For what he had lost. For the fact that the woman standing before him, strong, confident, unshaken, was no longer the woman he had the power to control. A long silence stretched between them. Then, he exhaled a slow, exhausted breath. "I want to fix it." Sophia stared at him. Then, a soft, Humorless laugh escaped her lips. Now you do. Alexander flinched. But he didn't argue. Didn't fight back. Didn't try to excuse himself. Instead, he nodded. I do. And for the first time, Sophia believed him. Did he deserve another chance? That was still unknown. But what she did know. She was no longer the woman who needed his validation. She was more. She had become more. And nothing, not even Alexander Cole, could take that away from her. The room was silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence. The heavy, suffocating kind. The kind that meant something had changed. Sophia Carter stood in Alexander Cole's office. The very office she had once cleaned. The very space where she had once been invisible. But now, she wasn't just standing there as his former housekeeper. She was standing there as someone with power. Someone he had wronged. Someone he was now begging for a second chance. Alexander leaned against his desk, running a hand through his hair. He looked different. Not the cold, arrogant businessman she had once known. Not the man who had dismissed her without a second thought. He looked exhausted, defeated. Say something, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Sophia tilted her head slightly, crossing her arms. You want me to say something? She said softly. Fine, here's something. She stepped closer, her voice calm but filled with weight. You didn't care about my voice before. You didn't care about my worth. You only cared about yourself. Alexander flinched, but he didn't argue, didn't deny it, because he knew it was true. Sophia let out a slow breath, shaking her head. You fired me, she said, because I proved I had something to say. Because I had a mind of my own. And now? She gestured to the chaos surrounding him. Now you need me. Alexander swallowed hard. Yes, he admitted, I do. The honesty in his voice surprised her. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. You're right about everything, he continued, his voice lower now. I was arrogant. I was blind. And I pushed away the one person who actually. He stopped, cut himself off. But Sophia caught it. That hesitation. That almost confession. Who actually what? She challenged. Alexander exhaled, his gaze locking onto hers. Who actually cared? Silence. Raw. Unbearable. Sophia felt something twist inside her chest. She hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected this. Because this wasn't just about business anymore. This was something else. Alexander took a step closer. Not in arrogance. Not in dominance. But in desperation. I know I don't deserve your trust. He said quietly. I don't even deserve this conversation. But I'm asking for it anyway. Sophia's breath hitched. The man before her, once untouchable, once so sure of himself, now looked vulnerable. And she wasn't sure how to handle that. He continued, voice softer now. I lost the investors. I lost my company's trust. I lost you. Sophia's fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted to believe him. But did people like Alexander really change? Or was this just another game? She swallowed, keeping her voice steady. And what exactly are you asking for? Alexander's jaw tightened. Then, I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be better. Sophia's heart pounded. She could feel it, the weight of the decision before her. Because this wasn't just about business. It was about trust. And trust? That was something Alexander had shattered. Sophia turned slightly, staring out of the window. I spent years in this house. She murmured, invisible, silent, cleaning up after you, after everyone, never once being seen. She turned back to him, her voice sharper now. But the second I was seen? You threw me away. Alexander's breathing turned uneven. And that's my biggest regret. Sophia studied him, his eyes, his expression. Was it real? Was he really saying this because he had changed? Or because he was desperate? She needed to know, needed proof. Because if she made the wrong choice, she wouldn't survive it. Finally, she sighed. I'm not saying I trust you, she warned. Alexander's gaze held steady. I wouldn't expect you to. She hesitated. Then, I'll give you one chance, she said. But if I see even a hint of the man you used to be, I walk away. And this time? She leveled him with a look. You'll never see me again. A beat of silence. Then, Alexander nodded. Deal. Sophia exhaled slowly. A part of her still didn't trust him. But another part of her wanted to believe. Because if someone like Alexander Cole could change, then maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. What do you think? Should Sophia give Alexander another chance? Or is it too late? Let us know in the comments. If you admire Sophia's strength and resilience, hit like to support her. Subscribe for more inspiring stories, because sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought with the heart. Sophia Carter had made her decision. She had given Alexander Cole one last chance. Not because she trusted him. Not because she had forgotten how he had discarded her so easily before. But because some part of her, a part she wasn't ready to admit, wanted to believe that change was possible. That redemption was real. That people could become better. And so, she stayed. But what she didn't know was that this second chance wouldn't just test Alexander. It would test her. Because the battle that was coming would push her further than she ever imagined. The storm arrived 3 weeks later. It came in the form of Kimberly Cole, Alexander's mother, a woman who had spent her life shaping her son into the ruthless businessman he was. And now, she saw Sophia as a threat. A mistake that needed to be erased. Sophia had known Kimberly was powerful. She had known the woman carried herself like royalty. Her presence commanding, her gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. But she wasn't prepared for the venom behind the words that came the moment Kimberly stepped into the office. "You," the older woman sneered, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor, "are an embarrassment." Sophia stood her ground, lifting her chin slightly. Kimberly scoffed, looking her up and down. "It's laughable." "Really?" she continued, the help thinking she belongs in a world she will never understand. Sophia clenched her fists. But she refused to break. Refused to bend. And that only made Kimberly hate her more. "I know what you're doing," Kimberly said, stepping closer, her voice dripping with disdain. Sophia stared at her, unflinching. "And what exactly is that?" Kimberly's smile was cold. "You think you can change him," she said smoothly. "You think you're special. That just because you put on a nice dress and sit in a meeting, it makes you someone of value." Sophia's breath hitched. Because this was the moment she had feared. This was the moment she realized Kimberly knew. She knew exactly how to wound her. How to bring back every insecurity Sophia had spent months burying. "You will never be more than what you were born to be," Kimberly whispered. And for a split second, Sophia felt it. The doubt. The fear. That maybe Kimberly was right. But then, a voice. Low. Steady. Filled with warning. "That's enough." Both women turned. Alexander stood in the doorway. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark with something Sophia had never seen before. Rage, protectiveness, and, for the first time, defiance. Against his own mother. "Leave," he told Kimberly, his voice dangerously calm. Kimberly's expression hardened. "I'm only saying what you're too blind to see," she snapped. Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "You're saying what I used to believe," he corrected. A beat of silence. Then, "I don't anymore." Sophia sucked in a breath. Because this was the real test. Kimberly's eyes narrowed. "I raised you," she hissed. "I made you into the man you are today." Alexander stepped forward. And for the first time in his life, he challenged her. "No," he said, "you made me into the man you wanted me to be. But that man?" His jaw tightened. "He's not who I want to be anymore." Kimberly went still. Sophia could feel the fury radiating off of her. The realization that for the first time, she was losing. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Kimberly turned to Sophia. Her lips curled. "You won't last," she whispered. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And then, just like that, she was gone. The room was still tense with the weight of what had just happened. Sophia exhaled slowly, turning to Alexander. "You just went against your mother," she said softly. Alexander didn't look at her. Instead, he ran a hand down his face. His expression weary. "I should have done it a long time ago," he admitted. His voice was tired, but also free, like he had just unchained himself from something that had been suffocating him for years. Sophia watched him. Something in her chest ached. Because for all his power, all his control, Alexander Cole had been a prisoner in his own life. And tonight, he had taken his first step toward freedom. Sophia exhaled, walking toward him. She wasn't sure why she did it, but something in her needed to. She reached for his hand. Alexander froze. His gaze flickered to hers, sharp, hesitant. And then, he let her. For the first time, he let someone in. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about something deeper. Something that neither of them were ready to name. But whatever it was It had just begun. The world didn't change overnight. Alexander Cole had spent years being a ruthless businessman. A man who had never looked beyond his own ambition, his own success. He had built his empire on power and control, dismissing anything, or anyone, who didn't fit into his vision. And now? Now, he was trying to unlearn everything his mother had drilled into him since childhood. It was exhausting. It was humbling. But every day, he woke up and tried. And Sophia Carter was watching. At first, she didn't trust it, didn't trust him. She had seen men like him before, men who said the right things when they needed to. Men who made grand gestures but never truly change. So she waited, watched. Because if Alexander Cole truly wanted to become a better man, he would have to prove it. Not just to her, but to himself. And, slowly, he did. It was in the little things. The way he started listening in meetings instead of dominating the conversation. The way he treated his employees, not as tools, but as people. The way he spoke to the investors, to the staff, to the people who made his company function. But most of all, it was in the way he looked at her. Like he was seeing her for the first time. Like he was learning from her. Like she mattered. One evening, after a long meeting, Sophia found herself walking beside him through the quiet hallways of his company's headquarters. It felt surreal sometimes. How far they had come. How much had changed. And yet, how much still lingered between them. Can I ask you something? Alexander's voice was softer than she was used to. Sophia glanced up at him. You just did. He smirked. You never make things easy. Do you? She shrugged. You wouldn't respect me if I did. His expression shifted. Something in his eyes deepened. No, he admitted. I wouldn't. Sophia's breath caught. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about business anymore. She looked away, trying to steady her thoughts. Trying to ignore the warmth spreading through her chest. So, she asked, what's your question? Alexander exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, a nervous gesture that felt so out of character for him. It made her pause. Then, do you think people like me can really change? Sophia stopped walking, turned to face him fully. And for the first time, she saw it. The doubt, the vulnerability, the fear. Alexander Cole, the man who once believed he was untouchable, was afraid. Not of failure. Not of losing money or power. But of something much bigger. Of never being able to escape the man he used to be. Sophia studied him carefully, choosing her words with precision. I think, she said slowly, that change is a choice. She stepped closer, her voice softer now. And I think you're making it. Alexander's jaw tightened. He didn't speak, didn't move, but in his eyes, she saw something shift, something break open. From that moment on, something was different between them. There was a new kind of tension. Not the kind born from resentment. Not the kind built on power struggles. But something else. Something undeniable. And neither of them were ready to admit it. As the weeks passed, Sophia saw the transformation happening. She watched as Alexander chose, again and again, to be better. She watched as he fought against every instinct. Every lesson his mother had taught him. And she saw how hard it was. Because the truth was, it wasn't easy. It was never easy to unlearn who you were. To fight against everything you had been raised to believe. But Alexander Cole was trying. And for the first time, Sophia found herself wanting to believe in him. Not just as a businessman. Not just as a leader. But as a man. One night, long after most of the office had cleared out, Sophia found herself in the company's rooftop lounge. The view of the city stretched out before her. Twinkling lights scattered across the skyline. She exhaled slowly, enjoying the peace. Then, a voice behind her. You always stay late. Sophia turned to see Alexander standing there, hands in his pockets. There was something different about him tonight. Something quieter. She smirked. So do you. He chuckled, stepping beside her. They stood in silence for a moment. Then, Alexander sighed. I used to stand up here alone, thinking I had everything figured out. Sophia glanced at him. And now? His gaze flickered to hers. Now, I'm starting to realize how much I don't know. Sophia's chest tightened. Because that was the difference. The old Alexander had been certain of everything. The new one? He was learning. And she admired that more than she wanted to admit. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge it. To feel it. The pull between them. The way he looked at her now, not with arrogance. Not with dominance. But with something real. something that scared her, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to run from it anymore. Change didn't happen in a single moment. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was in the small things. The quiet choices. The willingness to be better. And Alexander Cole was proving himself one day at a time. Sophia wasn't sure where this road would lead them. But for the first time, she was willing to find out. What do you think? Can Sophia truly trust Alexander's change? Or is she risking her heart? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in second chances, hit like to support Sophia's journey. Subscribe for more stories of redemption, love, and unexpected transformations, because sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Sophia Carter had never imagined this moment. Not when she had walked out of Alexander Cole's mansion months ago, carrying nothing but her pride. Not when she had faced his cold dismissal, his belief that she was nothing. Not even when she had returned, not as his housekeeper, but as his equal. But now, she stood beside him, not because he had given her power, but because she had taken it for herself. And this was the moment she realized she had won. Not against Alexander, not against his mother, but against the fear that had once controlled her life. Because now, she was free. Alexander had changed, truly, not just in words, not just in promises, but in action. Sophia had watched it happen. Slowly, piece by piece. She had watched him listen instead of dismiss. She had watched him fight his own instincts, his own demons, and she had seen him choose, again and again, to be better, for himself, and maybe, just maybe, for her, too. One night, as they walked through the city together, Sophia felt it, that quiet shift, that unspoken understanding. They had come so far. From enemies, to reluctant allies, to something else entirely. And tonight, under the glow of streetlights, Alexander reached for her hand. And this time, she didn't pull away. Are you happy? He asked softly, his thumb brushing against her skin. Sophia hesitated, because happiness was not something she had ever let herself fully believe in. She had spent so much of her life surviving, fighting, proving her worth. She wasn't used to softness, to the idea that love didn't have to be a battle. But looking at him now, at the man who had fought his own battles just to stand beside her, she realized something. She was happy. For the first time in her life, she was truly, genuinely happy. And that scared her more than anything. Alexander must have seen it in her expression, because he tightened his grip. And then, with a voice lower than she had ever heard before, he said, I know it's terrifying. Sophia's breath hitched. He knew. Of course, he did, because he felt it too. But, he continued, I don't want to live my life in regret. Sophia swallowed hard. Neither did she. That was the difference now. Before, she had been afraid to trust. Afraid to let herself believe in something real. Because real meant vulnerable. And vulnerable meant the risk of being broken. But Alexander wasn't just offering her love. He was offering her partnership. A life where she wasn't beneath him, but beside him. And for once in her life, she was ready to take it. They built something together. Not just a business. Not just success. But something stronger. Something built on trust. On understanding. On true, undeniable respect. And the world saw it. The people who had doubted them. The ones who had sneered at Sophia. Who had looked at her as though she would never belong. Now, they admired her. Respected her. Because she had earned it. Every single bit of it. Months passed. Seasons change. And one evening, as the sun set over the city, Alexander turned to her with something in his eyes she had never seen before. A kind of certainty. A kind of peace. And then, with quiet conviction, he said, I don't want to spend another day without you. Sophia's heart stopped, because she knew what was coming. She saw it before he even moved. Before he reached into his pocket. Before he got down on one knee. And suddenly, the woman who had spent her whole life feeling like she didn't belong, belonged to someone, not as a possession, not as an obligation, but as a choice, as his choice, and more importantly, as her own. I'm not asking you to say yes because it's the next step. Alexander murmured. His voice was steady, certain. I'm asking because I love you. Sophia swallowed the lump in her throat. I love you, he repeated, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. Tears blurred her vision, because for so long, She had believed love was conditional. That it came with rules. That she had to earn it. But this was freedom. And so, for the first time, Sophia let herself believe, and she whispered the one word she had never imagined saying to him. Yes, the wedding was small, intimate, not filled with business partners or fake smiles, but with the people who mattered. And as she stood beside him, hands clasped, heart full, she realized something. This wasn't just about finding love. It was about finding herself. Finding a life that was built on more than struggle. A life that was built on hope. On forgiveness. On the belief that even the most broken people can heal. And so, as she and Alexander danced under the stars, she whispered, "No regrets." He smiled, pulling her closer. No regrets. And for the first time in both of their lives, they truly meant it. Sophia Carter never thought her life would turn out like this. Not when she first stepped into Alexander Cole's mansion years ago as nothing more than a housekeeper. Not when he dismissed her, humiliated her, and discarded her like she was insignificant. And certainly not when she walked back into his life, this time as his equal. But now, she was standing beside him. As his wife. As his partner. And as a woman who had built something real out of the ashes of a past that had once tried to destroy her. Their life wasn't perfect. Far from it. They had both made mistakes. Mistakes that had cost them time, trust, and so much pain. But love? Real love wasn't about perfection. It was about effort. And every single day, Alexander proved to her that he was willing to fight for them. For their future. For the life they had chosen together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, they sat together on the balcony of their home. A home that was theirs. Not just a place of wealth, but a place of belonging. Sophia sighed, leaning against Alexander's shoulder. "This still feels surreal sometimes," she murmured. He chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You mean the part where you went from hating me to marrying me?" She smirked. "That's definitely part of it." Silence stretched between them, comfortable. Easy. Then, Alexander's voice softened. "I still think about the man I used to be," he admitted. Sophia glanced up at him. "Waiting. I think about the things I said to you. The way I treated people. The way I lived my life with so much arrogance." He exhaled, his fingers lacing with hers. "And sometimes, I wonder, would I have ever changed if I hadn't lost you?" Sophia's chest tightened, because she had wondered the same thing. Had he truly changed for himself? Or had he changed because losing her had shattered him? But maybe, in the end, it didn't matter. Because change, real change, came from actions. Not just words. And Alexander had spent every day proving that he was no longer that man. She squeezed his hand. "People can only change if they want to," she said. "You made that choice, Alexander. You made it for yourself." His eyes softened. "And I made it for you," he murmured. Sophia smiled. Because she knew. She knew that love wasn't about fixing each other. It was about growing together. And that was exactly what they had done. Months passed. Then years. And life moved forward in ways neither of them had expected. Alexander's company thrived, not because of power. Not because of greed, but because he had restructured everything to reflect true leadership. A leadership that valued people over profits. That invested in communities. That made a real, lasting impact. And Sophia? She became more than just his partner. She became a leader in her own right. She ran projects that uplifted underprivileged communities, ensuring that people like her, people who had been overlooked and undervalued, finally had opportunities to rise. Together, they built something far greater than just a business. They built a legacy of hope, a legacy of redemption, a legacy that proved it's never too late to change. One afternoon, as Sophia was reviewing a proposal for a new charity program, she heard a familiar voice. "Working hard as always?" She looked up, smiling as Alexander leaned against the doorframe. Watching her, she set her papers aside, stretching her arms. "Somebody has to make sure this company keeps doing the right thing." Alexander smirked. "And here I thought I was the CEO." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "You are, but we both know who's really in charge." He laughed, stepping forward and pulling her into his arms. "You've always been in charge," he murmured against her hair. She smiled against his chest. Because maybe, just maybe, that was true. As the years passed, their love only grew stronger. They faced hardships, They faced challenges. But through it all, they faced it together. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Because their story wasn't just about a second chance. It was about choosing each other every single day. No matter what. And now, to you, dear listener, what can we learn from Sophia's journey? From Alexander's redemption? From the story of two people who fought against everything to find their way back to each other. Here's what you need to remember. Know your worth. Never let anyone make you feel small. Sophia knew her value even when others didn't see it. And because of that, she rose higher than anyone ever expected. People can change, but only if they want to. Alexander didn't just change because he wanted Sophia back. He changed because he realized his own mistakes. And that's the only kind of change that lasts. Forgiveness is powerful, but trust must be earned. Sophia didn't forgive Alexander overnight. She made him prove that he had changed. And that's how trust is rebuilt, through actions, not words. Love is a choice. Every day, you choose the people you keep in your life. Love isn't just about grand gestures, it's about the quiet moments. The small acts of kindness. The unwavering support. You are in control of your own story. Sophia didn't wait for someone to save her. She built her own future. And you? You can do the same. Your story is still being written. Do you believe in second chances? Would you have forgiven Alexander? Let us know in the comments. If you admire Sophia's strength and resilience, hit like to support her journey. Subscribe for more stories of love, growth, and redemption, because sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful endings. Because in the end, the greatest love story is the one where you learn to love yourself first.